Thank you, gentlemen. Now, we will give each debater 6 minutes for his closing arguments. So in terms of Aristotle's view of argumentation, we've seen ethos, we've seen logos, now we'll hear some pathos. Now, each debater will summarize his case and will make a closing appeal for us to consider the validity of his arguments. And Dr. Craig, you take 6 minutes for your closing.
In my closing speech, let me attempt to draw together some of the threads in tonight's debate and see what conclusions we can come to. First, have we seen any good arguments to think that Schmadeism is true, the view that God does not exist? Well, I think not. Dr. Williamson, in his last speech in response to my argument about the absence of evidence not being evidence of absence, said, well, then he should be involved in disproving Allah. Well, Dr. Williamson obviously hasn't heard any of my debates with Muslim theologians on Canadian university campuses, where I do argue against the existence of Allah. I think there are definitely good reasons to think that Allah does not exist. So what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander, I agree. As for the incoherence of theism, the only point of contention that he brought up was why think that God doesn't have to have non-propositional knowledge? But I answer that it's because it's not true. What God must know to be omniscient is to know only and all truths. And non-propositional knowledge doesn't involve truth, so God doesn't have to have, and no one has ever claimed that he needs to have that sort of knowledge. As to the problem of evil, he simply retorted that to say that there might be sufficient reasons is just to repeat the problem. Now wait a minute, it's the atheist who has the burden of proof here. He needs to show us that necessarily, if God is all-powerful, then he can create a world of free creatures in which this much good is achieved without this much knowledge of God and eternal life. And he needs to show us that if God is all good, then he would want to create a world without suffering and evil in it, even though that would bring about less knowledge of God and less of his salvation. And that's just conjecture. So when you look at the debate, I don't think we've heard very good reasons tonight in favor of the position that God does not exist. Now, what about my arguments? First, the contingency argument. I think it became very clear during the dialogue time that I'm not begging the question of distinguishing necessary from contingent existence, and that this argument is a proof for the existence of an unembodied mind, because that's the only thing that could provide a metaphysically necessary explanation of the existence of the universe. As for the cosmological argument, again, during dialogue time, it became very evident that contemporary cosmologists are quite willing to speak of an absolute beginning of the universe, whether it be a singular or a non-singular beginning, and that this represents a finite past in which the universe began to exist. Notice that the philosophical arguments for the beginning of the universe have never been disputed in tonight's debate, so even without the scientific evidence, premise 2 stands on the basis of the metaphysical arguments I gave. What about the fine-tuning argument? Again, during the dialogue time, it became clear that Dr. Williamson was just begging the question and excluding design from the pool of live explanatory options. We can calculate these numbers, but when I said they're incomprehensible, I meant that they're too big to grasp. It's impossible for us to understand what 1 out of 10 to the 100 power means, which is the degree of fine-tuning of the gravitational constant, for example. And he admitted during the dialogue time that the probability of fine-tuning on theism is higher than it is on naturalism. And those of you who applauded this, boy, don't seem to understand that that just is to say that this is evidence for theism. That's what it means in probability theory, to confirm a hypothesis, to show that that hypothesis is more probable on the evidence than it's contradictory. So I rest my case, the fine-tuning argument goes through. What about the moral argument? Here, the key issue will be the need for an explanation of the existence of objective moral values. Shelley Kagan, who is an eminent ethicist at Yale University, says, this need for explanation in moral theory cannot be overemphasized. One of the things we want our moral theory to help us to understand is how there can even be a moral realm and what sort of objective status it has. Ultimately, unless we have a coherent explanation of our moral principles, we don't have a satisfactory ground for believing them to be true. And that is the dilemma that the atheists face. It's not that he has the wrong moral principles. Largely, he has them right. But he doesn't have any explanatory foundation for them. On naturalism, we're just relatively evolved primates, as he says, third species of chimpanzee, and there's no reason that we should think we have objective moral value or any objective duties to fulfill. But if you agree with me that raping and torturing a little girl for fun is wrong, then you should agree with me that God exists. Number 5, the resurrection of Jesus. You can't ground objective moral values without God. Then you can't ground them in naturalism, folks. 5, the resurrection of Jesus. He simply asks, what sort of evidence would you need? Well, you need some pretty good evidence. And isn't it remarkable that the majority of historians who have written on this subject agree with those 3 facts that I laid out? These are not the conclusions of conservatives. These are the conclusions of the majority of New Testament historians today, and I think it gives good grounds for believing that Jesus rose from the dead and was who he claimed to be. And therefore, number 6, the personal experience of God. It's not an argument, but it's an invitation for you to begin to look for yourself, to explore, and to see if God could be real. I believe that you can find him as a living, personal reality in your life. I know because he changed my life in that way, and I believe he could change yours as well.